Okay, guys, so today what we're going to do is we're going to look at the psychological, social risk factors for the development and progression of mental disorders, as well as look at this concept of cumulative risk. Okay, so we are going to cover spread 12C, 12D, and 12E today. If you remember, on Wednesday, we covered 12A and 12B, which basically looked at this thing called the 4P model, and these 4 factors that start with the letter P. 3 of them, which are predisposing, precipitating, and perpetuating, are called risk factors. Okay, they increase the risk of developing a mental disorder in the first place, or they contribute to the progression of a mental disorder. And remember, we said that progression means that you already have a mental disorder like depression, and it becomes worse as a result of that risk factor. Okay, so it worsens, in other words, or exacerbates. So we looked at some biological risk factors as well on Wednesday. And those were things like substance use, poor response to medication, all that kind of stuff that basically connects to the idea of how our biology or our body systems or our brain can actually contribute to the development of mental health disorders. So today what we're going to do is we're going to look at the more psychological aspects. And as you would know, the psychological factors in any topic, when we say the word psychological, we're talking about things with reference to memory, with reference to learning, with reference to the way that we think. Okay, all of these things are related to our psychological risk factors. Okay, psychological risk factors are more to do with things like, the way we think, process information, stress. Okay, it's all about our thoughts and feelings, in other words. So that's our psychological risk factors. So we're going to look at 4 specific ones today. Rumination, I'll explain them what that means. Impaired reasoning and memory, poor self-efficacy and stress. And you can use the memory tip RIPS, RIPS, to remember those 4. Okay, these are the only 4 that are required of you to know, that you're required to know as per the study design. Okay. So the first one is called rumination. Now, rumination means to repeatedly think about undesirable or negative thoughts. And you might be like, okay, well, rumination equals to overthinking, but actually they're not exactly the same thing. So just be careful there to not think that, to not associate them as being the same. When we're talking about overthinking is this idea that we do repeatedly think about thoughts, similar to the definition for rumination, but we do have the potential to change those thoughts if we want to. Okay, we do have the potential to act in order to make a difference there. People who ruminate or people who experience rumination, they repeatedly think about or dwell on undesirable thoughts, feelings, problems, and moods, but they don't act to change them. And this is one of the reasons that they stay in this dangerous cycle of constantly overthinking about things without doing anything to change them. Okay, so they're kind of stuck in the same place, in other words. Okay, people with mental disorders experience rumination because they don't believe that they have the ability to change their situation. And so they don't bother to think about solutions. Okay, and we're going to talk about how rumination is linked to another one of our psychological risk factors, which is basically talking about poor self-efficacy. Okay, so you're stuck in the problem and you're not actually doing anything to change that problem, okay, from a practical point of view. So you're repeatedly thinking about or dwelling on those undesirable thoughts, feelings, problems, and moods. You're not acting to change them. That's the main difference between overthinking and rumination. Okay, now rumination is a risk factor for mental disorders because when we ruminate, we keep piling up our negative thoughts about the problem or about the thing that we're stressing about, and that actually reduces or puts a big cloud over our problem-solving ability. It stops us from being able to seek treatment successfully. It stops us from being able to move away and think in more productive or helpful ways. Okay, so essentially it promotes a lot of negativity in terms of your thoughts, feelings, and behavior there. Now, if we're going to link rumination to the 4P model, we can say that rumination is a perpetuating factor because the more you ruminate, the more that you overly think about negative thoughts, feelings, and problems without doing something to change that, you are actually preventing your recovery, okay? Because you're not doing anything here, obviously, to change your situation, but you are just overthinking, overstressing yourself, getting yourself into a bad mood, thus preventing your recovery, thus maintaining your condition, whatever condition that is. Could be anxiety, could be depression, could be schizophrenia, whatever it is, you are contributing to the maintenance of that condition, okay, by preventing your own recovery. So that's what rumination is, guys. Rumination is just overthinking a problem or overthinking a stressor without doing anything to change that stressor, without using any coping strategies or using any methods to get out of the problem or get out of the situation that you're in. Okay, so the next thing that we're looking at is impaired reasoning and memory. Okay, guys, can everyone hear me? If you can, just say yes or something in the chat.
Yeah, miss, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right, okay, just 1 second. Okay, so the next thing that we're looking at is impaired reasoning and memory. So when we're talking about impaired reasoning and memory, we are talking about this idea that people who have depression or people who have any mental disorder or even just anxiety, these people generally have issues with, thinking in a normal way. Thinking in a normal way means that they tend to think in more negative ways. They tend to be irrational in their thinking. Irrational means that they say things and they sound very unreasonable. They sound very illogical. Okay. For example, they might see that someone hasn't said hi to them in public and they might make a huge issue out of that. They might be like, oh, this person probably doesn't like me. That's probably the reason that they took so long to, I don't know, like accept me on Instagram or something like that. Or they took so long to, follow me back, or they took so long to comment on my post or whatever. So then they start to get into this huge irrational and unreasonable and illogical spiral of negative thoughts, all of which make them appear to be affected by someone else, or make them appear to be negatively affected or in a negative light. They also tend to have decreased concentration and attention span. A lot of the time, this is because they're thinking about the other problems that they have. Okay, as you can see, the girl here, she's got all these multiple thoughts in her head, all of them talking about how she's negatively affected in some way. People with mental disorders, because of that deficit in concentration and attention, they also have issues with memory, particularly short-term memory. So if they are thinking about their thoughts as they're walking from their room to the kitchen, and they had to go to the kitchen to maybe get a snack, they forget what they came into the kitchen for. So those kinds of impairments in short-term memory also happen, as well as problems in language processing. Sometimes you're not able to express your thoughts. You're not able to put what you're feeling into words. Okay, even if someone says, let's talk about it, the person might be like, no, I don't think I can. Okay, and it's not just because they're emotionally in a bad state, it's because that language processing also gets affected as well sometimes for these people. So their ability to write about what they're feeling or talk about what they're feeling with someone is limited as well. Okay, you can see how all of these effects in red here in the first dot point can affect someone's daily functioning. And that's why we say that mental disorders cause dysfunction. Okay, one of the ways they cause dysfunction is by leading to impaired reasoning and memory processes. People with mental disorders like depression also show cognitive biases. What that means is that they have a negatively skewed or faulty way that they see their life and that they see the world around them. Okay, so for example, and it's always negatively skewed or biased negatively only for themselves, but not for other people. So a common example might be like, you might miss the bus, and a simple thing like missing the bus or missing the train, it's not something you could have controlled, but you start blaming yourself. You might say something like, oh my God, if only I was more organized, I wouldn't have missed the bus. But maybe the bus just left earlier than scheduled. Okay. Whereas if someone else gets the bus, you might be like, oh, they're so lucky. They always get the bus. They never miss it, but I always do. And so you start kind of getting into this self-blame, but it's only like directed towards yourself. So you're only harsh on yourself and kind of like strict on yourself, but not so much on other people. Other examples of cognitive bias are like jumping to conclusions. So like I said with that example before, if someone saw someone else in public, but they didn't say hi to them, they might assume that that person is having a grudge against them, when actually there's nothing like that. Maybe the person just didn't see them. Catastrophic thinking, okay, when you think of catastrophic thinking, think of the word catastrophe. What does catastrophe mean? It means the worst case scenario, the worst thing that could have possibly happened. People who have mental disorders, they tend to think of things in very catastrophic ways, and we call that catastrophizing, okay? Catastrophizing is when you have a situation and rather than thinking logically and being calm about it, you start thinking of the worst case scenario. So you start thinking, oh my God, I missed the bus. Oh my God, I'm going to be late to uni. Oh my God, my teacher's going to, mark me as absent. I'm going to have to catch up for extra classes. So you start thinking of all the worst case scenarios that could happen in that situation there. Now, in terms of the 4P model, impaired reasoning can be a predisposing factor if you have a tendency to think in such ways on a usual basis. Okay, we know that there are genes that are responsible for controlling anxiety. We know that certain people have imbalances in neurotransmitters that can actually influence them to be more naturally or more normally anxious than another person. If that's the case and it's inbuilt within you due to neurotransmitters or hormonal imbalances, we would say impaired reasoning and memory is a predisposing factor. If you have an issue, or if something happens to you, like an event that causes you to think in irrational ways, for example, seeing someone on the street who you thought was your friend, but they don't even say hi to you, that's an example of a precipitating factor, because that's an event that will cause you to think in very irrational or illogical ways. Okay. And perpetuating factor, how we know that impaired reasoning and memory can be a perpetuating factor is if we ourselves initiate the impaired reasoning and memory without any external event. So without any seeing someone in public, they don't say hi. So without any event like that, by ourselves, we build these kind of irrational and negative thoughts around us. We do this to ourselves. If we do this to ourselves and it's in our nature or it's a part of our habit to do this, this becomes a perpetuating factor for the simple reason that it prevents our recovery. When the girl thinks all these negative thoughts and all these negative thoughts start to surround her and almost suffocate her, she is actually preventing her recovery. She's not allowing herself to get better. Okay, so as we can classify impaired reasoning and memory into 3 types of factors from the 4P model, it really depends on what scenario you get. So look at the scenario you get, and depending on that, you can classify your factor accordingly. Okay, there's no clear-cut answer for this one. Also, there's a little tip from your book that says impaired reasoning and memory is one psychological risk factor. Okay, it's one thing. It's not impaired reasoning separately, impaired memory separately. It's actually one thing altogether. So if you get a question that says, okay, explain how Catherine demonstrated impaired reasoning and memory in the situation, in one part of that answer, you'll have to talk about impaired reasoning, and in the other part of the answer, you have to talk about memory as well. You can't just talk about only one and not the other. You're not going to get full marks if you do that, okay? So just make sure you realize this is a grouped factor. They're not individual factors by themselves. Okay, so that's impaired reasoning and memory. The next one is poor self-efficacy. So very simply put, self-efficacy basically means self-belief. It's your belief in yourself and your abilities to reach a goal in your life, okay? And you know what steps you have to take in order to achieve that goal. That's what high self-efficacy is, okay? Or that's what generally how we would define self-efficacy. People with mental disorders, as you would imagine, don't have a lot of high self-esteem in their abilities. They don't have a lot of self-confidence. And for this reason, we say that they generally have poor self-efficacy. Okay, one of the, if you do health, for example, one of the key examples of poor mental health is someone having low self-confidence or low self-esteem. Okay, we can add low self-efficacy to that list as well, because self-esteem, self-confidence, and self-efficacy are kind of like connected to one another. Okay, if you believe that you can perform the task well, as you can see in this axis here, the higher your belief is that you can perform a task well, the more your self-efficacy is, if you match this point to this point here, okay? Whereas the lower your belief is, the lower your self-efficacy is as well, okay? So that's basically showing you that your self-belief and your self-confidence directly influences how much self-efficacy you are going to have. Okay, people who have high self-efficacy, so we're talking about people who are generally mentally healthy, also tend to have high levels of functioning. And we talked about this as one of the characteristics of a mentally healthy person in chapter 11. Remember, high levels of functioning was one of those characteristics we specifically learned about. So people who have high self-efficacy also have high levels of functioning. And that basically means that they're able to, like, rather than the situation controlling them, they control the situation. Okay, that's the basic idea. Okay, they set goals, and they know that they can achieve them if they set their mind to it. They know that in order to reach that goal there's a missing piece here. They know what the missing piece is, and they've got it in their hand, or they're thinking about it, okay? They're thinking about what they can do to achieve that goal. In contrast, people who have mental disorders, like let's say depression, you know, anxiety, specific phobia, those people show poor self-efficacy. What that means is that they have low levels of functioning, okay? And that also means that they generally feel helpless over the situations that occur in their lives, and they give up easily. Okay, so that girl who, for example, in that previous slide I talked about, that girl who misses the bus, she gives up. She's like, okay, I'm going to go home. She doesn't think about the fact that maybe she can wait for the next bus, or maybe she can take an Uber, or maybe she can see if she can carpool with her friend who lives nearby. She doesn't think about the other characteristics there, or other plan B, or the other options that are there. Okay. If we talk about it with reference to psychology and with reference to school in any subject, when people with high self-efficacy, when they're given a series of questions to complete, and it's a lot of questions, they may not believe that they can, people with high self-efficacy will believe that they can do it, and they'll try their best to do it, maybe do like 12A on Monday, 12B on Tuesday, 12C, like they do one spread a day, and they make a goal or a kind of game plan for doing that activity. People with poor self-efficacy, however, they may not believe that they can do the task right from the beginning. They might be like, oh my God, this is too many questions, I can't do it. And thus the work piles up, and thus they fail to submit the work on time, okay? Now, you might be thinking, this relates to me, like I have a mental disorder. Okay, no, you don't have a mental disorder automatically, because poor self-efficacy is something people can have, even if you're mentally healthy. But if you have it for like a consistent period of time, or it affects your life to the extent that you miss out on, for example, university, or you miss out on going to school, or you miss out on completing your SACs, and that affects your life, that's when it can turn into something like a mental disorder, okay? But on an occasional basis, everyone has poor self-efficacy to some extent. It's to what extent you let that control your life, which actually matters. Okay, in terms of the 4P model, poor self-efficacy acts as a predisposing factor most of the time, again, to do with motivation and internal, internal kind of drive towards doing tasks. But poor self-efficacy can also act as a precipitating factor or a perpetuating factor too. It acts as a precipitating factor if you develop poor self-efficacy as a result of an external event, like being given 3 chapters of work to do in 1 week. Okay, you can't blame yourself for that, because that's probably something you'd blame your teacher for, because 3 chapters of work to do in 1 week is too much. Okay. Perpetuating factor is if you let poor self-efficacy prevent your recovery, that becomes a perpetuating factor. Okay, so it's important to be able to understand that depending on the scenario you get, you can actually determine whether poor self-efficacy is predisposing, precipitating, or perpetuating there. And this meme here just basically says poor self-efficacy is just a very fancy, wise way of saying you can't be stuffed or can't be bothered. Okay, because honestly, if you really break down the definition, that's what it is. It's this inability to be motivated or bothered to do something. But we would say it's more due to your own belief in your ability, not just because you're lazy, but because you genuinely believe you can't do something. Okay, so that's what poor self-efficacy is there. Okay, this is a scenario, guys. I want you to just take, maybe just read the scenario and then just identify the example of poor self-efficacy that you see in this scenario. So I'll give you guys about 2 minutes, 1 minute to read the scenario, 1 minute to answer the question. So with this question, you can see that we know poor self-efficacy is about a person's ability, lack of ability to believe in themselves, in their ability to do something or reach a goal. So we just link what we know about poor self-efficacy to Alex's situation. So we can say, Alex feels that he's not good enough to get selected for the squad. Okay, and I've just quoted not good enough from the scenario. You don't have to, but just showing you that that's taken from the scenario there. Okay, so that's the question. It's only worth 1 mark, but again, showing you that it's not just important for you to know examples of what poor self-efficacy is, but know what are the characteristics of it, what does it actually mean. Okay, so this tests your ability of the key concept there. Okay, good work. So let's move on to the next factor, which is stress. Stress is something we've gone through a lot in chapter 3. And we know that from chapter 3 that stress is both a biological process because of the gas model, but more importantly for this chapter, when we look, or this spread, when we look at stress, we also look at stress as a psychological process. Okay. Does anyone remember the name of the model? If you remember the name of the model, put it in the chat box. That's associated with primary appraisal and secondary appraisal.
The Lewis-Folkman, something like that.
Yeah, Lazarus and Folkman's. Yeah, Lazarus and Folkman's transactional model of stress and coping. Good work. Okay, so as you remember, in that model, we looked at two types of appraisal. Primary appraisal is our initial interpretation or judgment of a stressor. Secondary appraisal is the afterwards, like how do we learn to cope with
the coping.
Yeah, so we can learn in terms of like emotion-focused coping or problem-focused coping, yeah? So when we're looking at stress and we're looking at its connection to mental disorder, which is obviously something we always have to remember, these two are closely connected. The more stress you have and the more consistent that stress is, the less able you feel that you're able to cope with that stress, the more likely it is to lead to a mental disorder developing or progressing for that matter. We know that there are various sources of stress, again, that we learned from chapter 3, that can determine what kind of stress we have. Life events, major stress, daily pressures, catastrophes, acculturative stress. And we know that not all of these, probably except daily pressures and life events, but major stress, acculturative stress, catastrophes are not something that all of us are going to go through in our lives, okay, or in our lifetime. So we have to remember some people have it worse than others when it comes to stress. Those people who have it worse than others, if they don't have proper coping mechanisms or that stress is too much for them to take, that can lead to them developing a mental disorder, okay? Or so they can lead to them developing or getting the mental disorder in the first place, or if they've already got the mental disorder, like they've already got depression and now their home gets hit by a bushfire, they've got depression and now it becomes even more worse, even more intense and even more severe than it was before, okay? So basically, in terms of the 4P model, stress can function as those three factors as well. Depends on the scenario. It can function as a predisposing factor because, as I said before, some of us have differences in our brain chemistry, which means that we have an imbalance of neurotransmitters that can influence some of us to stress or become anxious a lot more than others, okay? That's an internal thing that we can't really control as much. A precipitating factor is when a life event or an external event causes that stress to occur or increase for us. For example, your home getting hit by a bushfire or a cyclone, breaking up with a long-time friend or a partner or something like that, that can be a precipitating cause for stress. Perpetuating means that your stress is your ability to stress and basically stress for every little thing that happens in your life and feel like you don't have control, okay, or you lack that control. You allow yourself to become overwhelmed by letting work pile up. That is then a perpetuating factor, okay, because that is preventing your recovery then. Okay, so this little useful tip from your book is really good because it says that even though in chapter 3, we did learn about stress as being both biological through the GAS model and psychological through the transactional model of stress and coping. In this chapter, with reference to mental health, you're only ever going to be asked about stress as a psychological risk factor, okay? You're only ever going to be asked to explain the psychological aspects of stress if you get a question about stress and mental health, okay? You don't need to talk about GAS model in that instance there, okay? That's why stress in this outcome comes under the heading of psychological risk factor rather than biological risk factor. Okay, so that's the basic idea. And then this is basically linking the 4 factors to the psychological model, literally the last dot point from each of the slides here, but just summarized into the table that the Edroller book has. Okay, so now we're looking at the social risk factors. The social risk factors are a little bit more straightforward than the psychological ones. They're a little bit more simple, in other words. Okay, so the 3 that we're looking at are stigma as a barrier to accessing treatment. And we did learn about stigma last year as well when we looked at the mental disorders in Unit 1. And we did that mental disorder research project, if you remember. We did learn about what stigma was. Okay, and you might have learned this as well in Health and Human as well. Loss of a significant relationship is another social risk factor. And the last one is disorganized attachment. So what you notice here, guys, with the social risk factors is we're not focusing on the person's mental processes like their thoughts, feelings, or emotions. We're focusing on more external factors. Okay, these are factors that are not so much in the individual's control. They're more external, okay, influenced by what society thinks or how society behaves, influenced by other people or relationships around us, or influenced by something as close as a caregiver relationship or a relationship a baby has with their mother, which is what attachment is about. Okay, so that's basically the difference between the psychological factors and the social risk factors. So the first one is disorganized attachment. We learned about the 4 types of attachment styles last year when we did psychology in I think it was unit 1. So remember that disorganized attachment is a type of insecure attachment. If you remember last year, we learned about secure attachment, which is the best type of attachment style. Then we learned about insecure attachment. If we were to say that there's a type of attachment style that's actually worse than insecure attachment, it would be disorganized attachment. Disorganized attachment is this idea that a child shows inconsistent behavior. So one time they want to be with the mum, the next time they don't want to be with the mum. The behavior is inconsistent or contradictory because the mother or the caregiver there hasn't given them that consistency that they need. Remember, babies work on consistency. Okay, as soon as they cry, they expect the mother to come and hold them, or they expect the mother to feed them. Okay, if a baby's or infant's caregiver or mother is not giving them that consistent love, consistent care, and consistent support, they are likely to get mixed signals from that caregiver, and they are likely to not know what to expect, and they're likely to ask themselves, is it safe to turn to my mom and dad for comfort when I'm scared? Okay, so the child themselves starts to show inconsistency or unpredictable behaviors. So one example of this could be that they run up to their mother excited, to be carried. The mother picks them up, maybe because the baby's right in front of them at their feet. The mother picks the baby up, and then the baby's like starts crying and says, put me down, I don't want to be with you anymore. So that's inconsistent behavior. Okay. In terms of the 4P model, disorganized attachment is a predisposing risk factor. The reason being that a lot of the time, the child has very little control over how their caregiver acts. Okay, you as a baby, you expect your mum or your dad to be the best parent possible, but you can't control that. That's the thing. So for that reason, it's a predisposing risk factor. Okay, and it does contribute to the susceptibility or increased risk of developing a mental disorder later in life. The reason being that when you have poor attachment style, or you don't have a good relationship with your caregiver or bond as you're growing up from being a baby to childhood, it can lead to a lot of trust issues, can lead to a lot of stability issues. Okay, you feel like there's no safety or security for you. Nothing is certain. Okay, nothing is predictable. There's a lot of behavioral issues that come up. So the child takes up their vented up frustration and starts, bullying people at school, or starts projecting that frustration on others around them. There's a lot of difficulty managing emotion, difficulty in forming secure relationships with other people. So when this little girl or this baby here, when they get older and it's time for them to get into a new relationship, they might be very cautious about letting people in, or they might be very cautious about not letting themselves become vulnerable in that situation there. Okay, so that's what disorganized attachment is. Some more examples here, and just showing you in this picture here, it's just repeated from the previous slide, but just showing you how disorganized attachment increases the likelihood or susceptibility of a mental disorder, because it actually contributes to low social and emotional well-being. So if you remember from the 3 characteristics in chapter 11, just like high levels of functioning, social and emotional well-being is another characteristic of a mentally healthy person. And someone with disorganized attachment is going to be less likely to show high social emotional well-being. So they are more likely to show low social and emotional well-being, okay, as a result of their poor attachment style that they had when they were younger. Okay, the next one is loss of a significant relationship. When we're talking about loss of a significant relationship, the first thing you might think of is death, like losing someone you love because of them dying. That is mostly what it's about, but it's also about just losing someone because of separation as well. Okay, we know that not all people who, for example, get married or in a long-term relationship, not all of them, it doesn't always work out. So if you're separating from that person, but they were giving you a lot of support and, they were very important for your mental health, if you separate from that person, you no longer have that source of social support. And so that can actually lead to an increased risk of developing a mental disorder. Okay, loss of a significant relationship just means you lose someone who was important to you. That's the word significant. And you were emotionally attached to that person. Okay, that doesn't mean it has to be a husband or wife or partner versus partner. It could just be a friend. It could be, a close mentor. Okay, like maybe if this girl was a part of a soccer club from when she was very young, and then recently her soccer coach who coached her for so many years passed away, she might feel the loss of that soccer coach because he brought her a lot of emotional support. Okay. One of the reasons why loss of a significant relationship, either through that person dying, so either through death or through separation, can be so impactful as a social risk factor is because when people are disconnected from other people, either because the person dies or either because there's a separation or a breakup there, these events tend to cause a high level of grief, sadness, as well as stress. Okay, and these three are like a triad for basically mental disorders developing. Okay, they're basically three factors that will, in most people, increase the likelihood of mental disorders developing there. Okay, obviously, if protective factors like resilience will determine whether that goes to the extreme or whether that grief, sadness, and stress is just short term. Okay, like I said, some people can have prolonged grief that causes them to not be able to move on with their lives and to become dysfunctional, thus developing a mental disorder. But some people might grieve or might be upset about it, but then learn to move on. These are the people who are less likely to develop a mental disorder. Okay, and this is mostly because they've got high levels of resilience, which we'll learn about more in chapter 14. Okay, so because loss of a significant relationship does cause you a lot of grief, does contribute to a lot of stress and sadness, we say that it contributes as a precipitating risk factor in terms of the 4P model. Okay, because if you're already a bit anxious or stressed, if someone close to you gets separated from you, or they die, or they pass away, or whatever, that's likely to increase the risk of you developing a mental disorder or worsen an existing mental disorder. Okay. And remember, just be very careful with the way you word this. It's not loss of a loved one, it's loss of a significant relationship. If you write loss of a loved one in a SAC or exam, this is complete automatic 0. That's wrong. That's not the terminology. Loss of a significant relationship, not even loss of an important relationship. Make sure it's exact. It should be loss of a significant relationship. Okay, so that's the idea. Okay, and okay, so I think I already kind of gave you a clue for this, and I'll give you guys about 20 seconds to do this. I think it's really straightforward. So just read this and answer the best option there.
Miss, wouldn't losing a significant relationship obviously be someone you love?
It can be, but that's not the terminology that we say.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, guys, what do we think?
D?
D.
Yeah, most people are saying D. Good work. It is D. The answer is D. Okay, the reason being that, yes, most of the time a significant relationship is usually a loved one because people we love are important to us. But when we look at the word loss of a significant relationship, we need to unpack that. We need to remember significant relationship means any relationship that's deemed valuable and important to you. Okay, especially because loss of a loved one often implies that the person is someone close to you, like, for example, a sibling, or, for example, a mother or father, or someone like that. For example, if you had a university lecturer who you had a close bond with and helped you through a PhD or something, and he passed away, he's important to you and he was a big mentor for you throughout your life, but he's not really a loved one. So that's why circling this would have been problematic. Okay, that's why the best answer is D. Okay, awesome. So let's keep moving on. Okay, so the last social risk factor that we're looking at is called stigma. From last year, you might remember that stigma actually means negative labeling, okay, or a negative kind of mark of shame or mark of disgrace that you put on someone because of something. We talked about last year that people who, especially like mental disorders like schizophrenia, these people are often labeled as psychotic or psycho, okay, and that there's a lot of fear around these people. Okay, they're usually disapproved by society, or they're disgraced by society, or they're ostracized, which means that they're excluded by the rest of society. Okay, this doesn't only apply to schizophrenia, though. We can apply it to any mental disorder, depression, specific phobia. For example, if someone sees a spider in the room and starts screaming, people will have a higher tendency to laugh at that person as compared to actually think that, oh, that person has specific phobia. They probably are experiencing, you know, a high physiological kind of response right now. Okay, so people don't actually think like that usually in society. Okay, so stigma is negative labeling that occurs to patients with any disorder, could be physical, but in our case we're looking at mental. Okay, causing them to feel ashamed, and disapproved of by society. You don't have to mention every single term here. Just pick any two there and just name any two. Okay, why is stigma an issue? Stigma is an issue because as a mental disorder patient, maybe I can just shrug it off and I'm like, I don't care if everyone thinks I'm a psycho, whatever, I don't care. But the issue, the real issue is, and the research shows that people with mental health problems or mental health issues, whether it's just anxiety, whether it's a full-blown mental disorder like depression, when they are stigmatized by others in society, they tend to hesitate to seek treatment. They tend to be like, oh, I don't need to go to the psychologist. I don't need to go to the doctor. I don't need to go to the counselor to talk about my issues, because what if someone sees me? Okay. This is a big thing in a lot of cultures. What will people say? Okay. What will people say if they were to see me leaving the psychologist's office? Okay. They might start to say that, oh, I've got mental health issues, blah, blah, blah. And we have to remember, in a lot of cultures, mental health is still stigmatized. Okay. It's still something that people don't believe it's a thing. People don't believe that things like depression exist in many cultures around the world. Okay. We also have to remember that if the patient who's been stigmatized is experiencing all these feelings in this image here, okay, they're not going to be likely to go and seek treatment straight away. When they don't seek treatment straight away, they're delaying the treatment. They're delaying a possible diagnosis there. They're not getting the medication or treatment or therapy that they need, and they're basically making their symptoms worse in the long run. So what started off as mild depression, because this person hadn't gone and got the treatment when they needed it straight away, has come to the point where it's severe. They're no longer attending work. They're no longer attending school. It's gone to the extent where it's now out of their total control. Okay. And that's because they delayed treatment because they were worrying that people were judging them, that people were negatively labeling them. Okay. In terms of the 4P model, stigma is a perpetuating factor. It's a pretty obvious perpetuating factor, because by not accessing the treatment because of fear of being negatively judged or labeled by society, the patient prevents their own recovery. And in preventing their own recovery, they maintain their condition. Okay, that's the idea. Now, these cartoons on the right-hand side basically show you what it would be like. It's a part of a comic strip that was titled If Physical Illness Was Treated the Same as Mental Illness. And you can see, like, you would never go up to a person who's lying in bed with food poisoning and say, I get that you have food poisoning, but you have to at least make an effort. But this comment is often made to people with depression, okay? Another comment that's often made to people with depression and other mental disorders is, have you tried, not being depressed? And you would never say that to someone who has the flu or someone who's vomiting in the bathroom because they've got a virus, okay? So again, there's a lot of stigma around mental health conditions compared to some of the more physical health conditions, which are often given more importance there, okay? Telling someone to snap out of it is another example of stigma. Again, undermining the actual experience that this patient is having. Okay, so those are our social risk factors. And again, summarizing those three in a table, how we classify them with reference to the 4P model. Again, this was all mentioned on the slide, but this is just a summary from the book there. Okay, and this is a table. I don't even remember where I got this from, to be honest. I got it at some point. But again, it's pretty much consistent with what we've talked about. Again, some of these factors can act as all three, as we looked at in the slide. It just depends on the scenario, okay? Here, stress is a precipitating risk factor, because in most scenarios, stress will act as a precipitating risk factor, but it's important to also read the scenario as well. If the person has a tendency to stress, and that tendency is, something like a habit of theirs, that might then become a perpetuating risk factor. So it really depends on the situation that you get. Okay, the last thing that we're looking at before we finish off in the 10 minutes or so that we have left is basically cumulative risk, okay? So cumulative risk is this idea that we looked at the three risk factors now. So we've looked at biological factors, we've looked at psychological risk factors and social risk factors. We're looking at the middle of that Venn diagram. Now, this middle of the Venn diagram is called cumulative risk. This is the idea that when biological risk factors, psychological risk factors, and social risk factors combine together, okay, they have no individual effects anymore, okay, or just isolated effects. They start to combine together and have a total effect, okay? Can anyone tell me in the chat box, what does the word accumulate mean? When something accumulates, what does it mean? To build up together? Yeah, excellent. To increase, good. So when we're saying that biological, psychological, and social risk factors are combining, as a result of them combining together to create this concept of cumulative risk, what cumulative risk means is basically the gathered up or the built up or the piled up risk of all those stresses working together. That's what cumulative risk is. It's basically the biological factors plus the psychological factors plus the social factors combining together, and the total effect that these have, or the total accumulated piled up risk that these three factors have, is known as the cumulative risk there. Okay, you might have come across the word cumulative when you do maths as well. Okay, so cumulative risk just means the total aggregate risk. Okay, and the total aggregate risk, remember, the total of something is always worth more than its parts or more than its individual components. So cumulative risk can actually also contribute to the development of the disorder in the first place. Or if you've already got the mental disorder like depression, it can work to make it worse. So that's the basic idea there. Okay. So that is what we're looking at with cumulative risk. Okay, so going to the next slide. Just what I talked about in the previous slide. So cumulative risk refers to the total risk, and these are the keywords, I'll just circle them. The total risk to mental health from the combined effects of biological, psychological, and social risk factors. If you just mention those three components, so this, and these ones I've underlined, that's enough for your definition there. Okay, what is cumulative risk? If we talk about cumulative risk in terms of the general idea or a general example, we already talked about the fact that cumulative means to accumulate or pile up. Look at this example here. Jogging along a busy street is already a risk by itself because you're more likely to get hit by a car, you're more likely to, run into a hazard. Okay, jogging along a busy street can always be at risk, okay? However, if you're jogging along a busy street at night, you got a +1 risk added there, okay? So this was already +1. Now this has become another +1, so the total risk is now 2, okay? Now, jogging along a busy street at night, this is already risky, and now you're adding another risk to the equation, which is you're jogging along a busy street at night and it's pouring. The rain is pouring down, there's a storm. This is adding another risk there. So now your total risk kind of comes to 3. Okay, so rather than this individual risk by itself, which isn't so bad of a risk or so harmful for your survival or health there or well-being, when you're adding these extra risks along with the previous risk, you're actually leading to a piling up of risk or an accumulation of the risk, okay, where the total number of risk here is greater than the individual risk alone. Okay, that's the idea. And the danger now is going to be increased. This is just with reference to a general example. We're not linking this to mental health, but just to show you guys how having one risk factor in your life is not going to lead to you having a mental disorder. So having a bit of stress in your life during BCE, as one of you asked before, it's not going to directly lead to a mental disorder for every single person. Maybe for some, maybe for others, we don't know, okay? But it's not going to lead to that mental disorder being guaranteed to develop for every person. However, if you've got a person who's got stress from VCE in their life, so stress from VCE, okay, yes, they've got that, that's one risk factor, but then they've got other risk factors too. Let's say, let's say they got fired from their part-time job. Okay, so maybe they were working at, I don't know, KFC. They got fired from KFC for, I don't know, eating too much fried chicken on the side during the break. I don't know. Okay, 3. So that's another risk there, okay? You're adding another risk factor there, which already increases the stress that they have. Number 3, maybe their parents broke up during the VCE. Okay, the parents were already having marriage issues throughout the kid's childhood, and now they decided the best time to break up was during their child's VCE. That's another stress. This person was already stressed. Now they've got more stress from being fired from KFC, more stress from their parents breaking up. Number 4, is usually the cherry on the top, or basically what leads to, no, not the cherry on the top, what am I saying? The straw that broke the camel's back, okay? So number 4 is basically the stressor that now kind of cements the rest of those, or kind of contributes to the full-blown development. So number 4 might be something like, let's say, someone's death. Let's say the death of the, I'm going to be really mean now and say the death of her beloved cat. Yes. Okay, this is quite upsetting. So the death of her beloved cat. Okay, so this student was already stressed from everything else. Now she's lost her beloved cat. Okay, so stress, 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 stress. These are all risk factors. The risk factor that actually contributes to the development of the disorder might be the last one here, and this is known as the precipitating risk factor. Okay, because it's the life event or the experience that she's gone through that actually ends up causing or ends up contributing to the development of depression there. So that's what we call as a precipitating risk factor there, okay? So you need to understand that in this example or in any of the examples we looked at before as well, there's a piling up of risk factors, okay? This piling up of risk factors can only contribute to the development of a mental disorder if that person has no other protective factors. So this person's been fired from KFC, no one from KFC contacted her to ask her how she was feeling. None of her work colleagues who were so good with her while she was working, they bothered to check in on her. Her parents broke up, but none of them bothered to ask her how she was feeling. None of her teachers at school bothered to excuse her or give her time extensions for work, okay? No one bothered to hold a funeral for her cat. So all of these risk factors, in the absence of protective factors, can increase the chance of a mental disorder developing. However, if you've got protective factors, as we can see in this example here, you are less likely to develop a mental disorder. So if we talk about, for example, driving on a busy road, it starts raining, you then discover that your brakes aren't working properly and you're getting really stressed, but then you remember in your head that, oh, it doesn't matter, even if I get into a crash, I've got car insurance and I can pull over and get assistance if I need to, okay? So then you remember that, okay, everything's all good. Okay, if you've got that protective factor there with you, the chances of those accumulated risks or cumulative risk factors are going to be decreased. You're going to have a decreased risk of developing a mental disorder. Sorry, say it again.
Is it like resilience?
Yes, so example, if you've got good resilience in the last step here, or if that girl in the previous example had good resilience, even if her parents break up, she'll be like, it's okay, I can still spend time with both of them on weekends. Even if she's got stress, she'll still ask her teacher for more help, or she will, you know, try to figure out how she can manage her time better. So having resilience might reduce the chances of those risk factors from causing an actual mental disorder to develop. Yeah, that's a good protective factor there. We're going to learn about other protective factors as well in chapter 14. I just want to go back to this, this really good analogy that I found online about cumulative risk. If you think about mental health and, you know, mental health as being like this cup, we don't want the cup to overflow, okay? Because if the cup overflows, when it overflows, we develop a mental health disorder. Okay, the negative experiences that we have in our life tend to fill up our cup. So in the example that we talked about with the cat dying, that would fill up that girl's cup a little bit, okay, because that is obviously a grief, a situation that would cause grief. Okay, some things keep topping our cup back up. If that girl doesn't have resilience, so no resilience or no proper coping strategy or plan, or she's got like poor self-efficacy or something, that will also keep topping the cup back up. The water continues to build up there in the cup. Some of us are born with water in our cup already, okay? If this girl was, for example, already, if both of this girl's parents who divorced or who broke up, they had depression, okay? It was in their genes already. This girl's cup is already starting to fill when others are already empty, okay, at birth, because she's already been born with the gene for depression, okay? In other cases, some are poured in when we're very young. So if this girl, for example, had disorganized attachment style with her parents as a young infant, her cup has already started to fill at times where other infants' cups have not even started to fill yet, okay? However, some things can help us to empty our cup. Remember, we don't want the cup to overflow, because if it overflows, that's when we develop the mental disorder. But some things can help us to empty the cup. Again, these are our protective factors. So as Zoya said before, resilience is one of them. Okay, we're also going to learn about the importance of things like diet. Okay, the importance of things like social support. These are factors we learn about in chapter 14. So there are also other factors that we don't learn in chapter 14 that can still be helpful. For example, having good sleep patterns, for example, having good coping strategies for stress. All of these things can also help, even though we'll specifically won't cover them in chapter 14. But as you know, we did cover them in earlier chapters. Okay, so these can also help as well. So that's just the cup analogy for you to understand what cumulative risk works, or how cumulative risk works, okay? So I'm going to give you guys a practice question. This practice question now. So remember, I want you to read this scenario now. Look at the risk factors that are in his life. Look at the risk protective factors that Milos has, if you can spot any, and then determine whether he's going to be very likely to develop a mental disorder or not likely to develop one at all. So I'll give you guys about 3 minutes now to work on this question. And I'll just pause the recording until we finish the question. Okay, so as we looked at, we just annotated this scenario now, and we annotated.
Can you answer? Like in the chat, can you tell me like if it's right?
Let me see. Yeah, that's correct. Good work. So all of you guys in the chat, all of you mentioned that he would have a low likelihood, which is correct there. So what we've done here is we've just annotated the scenario and we've underlined which ones are risk factors in R and which ones are protective factors in P, okay? And we have to weigh the risk factors versus the protective factors, and we have to comment on the likelihood. So I'll just show you guys the scenario, the answer. Just give me a second. Okay. So although the risk factors seem to be accumulating in Milos's life, the risk of him, the total risk of these contributing to the development of mental disorder is low. So that's 1 mark there. This is because Milos is also showing protective factors. For example, he eats well, he exercises daily, and as his wife works full-time, she can share the financial responsibility as well. If you talked about anything like resilience and stuff, that's really good. I haven't put that in the sample answer here because we haven't covered resilience yet for mental health, but if you've remembered it from previous when we did stress and stuff, then that's really good. Okay, so that's the idea. So you got 1 mark for discussing the accumulating or piling up of risk factors and mentioning whether it's high or low risk, and then 1 mark for justifying your answer there. Okay, so most of you were pretty spot on with your answer for this one. So good work. And this is taken from the VCA sample exam from 2017. Okay, let's move on to the last slide, which looks at the strengths of the cumulative risk theory. Look, this is not actually a topic in your Edrolo book, but as I say, I love Edrolo, I love the textbook, but there are some parts of it where I feel like the information is not enough. I always talk about the importance of being able to evaluate topics. In the Jacaranda book, we did have this idea of evaluating the theory, which I think is good. So that's why I've kept it in. And VCA are very likely to be able to ask you this. It's not kind of off the table, okay? So if you were ever asked to evaluate the cumulative risk theory, you would mainly be asked about the strengths of the theory. There are no real limitations with the theory, except that maybe you could say different people have different risks throughout their lives, but we're more focused on the strength of the cumulative risk theory. The number 1 strength is that it shows us that risk factors are not just acting in isolation, but they act in a very holistic way, and they provide a holistic view of how risk factors behave to develop or contribute to the development of mental disorders. It also talks about the snowballing effect, okay? So the cumulative risk theory demonstrates the snowballing effect that basically tells us that, you know, in those movies where people are like at the bottom of this, like at the bottom of a mountain, and then they look up and they hear like a rumbling noise, and then the snow kind of comes down, and as the snowball comes down, it gets bigger and bigger because it starts to gather all the snow from above. So think of that as being similar to cumulative risk, okay, where the snowball represents the risk or the total risk factors that a person experiences. Okay, as the person goes through more and more risky risk events like separation, losing a job, stress from school or work, okay, that snowball continues down that mountain and continues to gather more and more risk attached to it, okay? By the time it gets to risk 5 or 6 at the bottom here, you are very likely or at a high risk of developing mental disorders, particularly if there are no protective factors there for you. So in any scenario that you get, just make sure you read the scenario, but don't automatically assume that the person will have a high risk of developing a mental disorder just because they've got a lot of risk in their life. Look at whether they've got protective factors. If they do have protective factors, there's a less risk of them developing a mental disorder. If they don't have protective factors, then there's a higher risk of them developing a mental disorder. So you have to look at it as a whole, not just pick bits and pieces of the scenario and then make an assumption there. Okay, so that's the basic idea of what cumulative risk theory is. And I think with that, we are done. So this is just an overview of the huge chapter that was chapter 12, just showing you all the different topics that we looked at in chapter 12. So when you're studying for the SAC, you can kind of put a little tick next to each box as you learn the topics or revise the topics. All right, guys, I'm going to stop the recording here. And with this, guys, we are done with chapter 12.